Hi, good afternoon. As he said, my name is Samantha Hawkins. I'm an Interdisciplinary Studies and Anthropology major here at UMBC. To begin, I'd like to, of course, thank my faculty. This project would not be possible without their help. So thank you to Carrie Souther, Stephen Silberg, and Seth Messinger. Just before I tell you anything about my project, we're going to do a quick little exercise. Close your eyes. Imagine a brown dog. Think about what it looks like. Keep that image in your mind. All right, now open your eyes. Whose dog looked like that? Raise your hand. Kind of? Okay, cool. Does anyone want to tell me what their dog looked like? Yeah?
Brown lab.
Brown lab? Anything different?
Brown husky.
Husky, okay.
Capstone.
Yeah, so we have all different kinds of dogs. But that's not the dog I was talking about. The image has an extraordinary power in our culture. There's the cliche that an image is worth 1,000 words. It would probably take at least 1,000 words for me to get you to even fathom a close picture to what that dog looked like. So visual media, because it's everywhere, we have almost an obligation as researchers to take this new technology that's coming out and looking for a way that we can harness it and apply it to academic and specifically anthropological research. Now in our pockets today, we probably have one or in front of us 2 devices that can capture a photo. We have photos that have inundated our culture. So how then can we use those photos, how can we use visual media in general for good, in the academic context? How can we use it to supplement other research that we are currently doing? So my capstone question was, what are the key elements to a visual research methodology? How can they be applied in a qualitative ethnographic research project? And I used these questions and structured my construction of a methodology by trying to apply it to anthropological research I was conducting in Baltimore. So visual research, roughly defined, is really any visual material that you can use to help aid the viewer or the reader for your research. It could be drawings, photographs, film, digital renderings, anything produced or found by the researcher or produced by the research subject. I know in my Baltimore research, it involved photos of street graffiti, archival materials from the Maryland Historical Society, and keepsake photos from interviewees that they gave me. So why are visual methods important? Why not use another form of research method? It makes research more accessible. It provides detailed documentation, and there's no clearer documentation of a research setting than an actual photo. You can try to describe it to someone as we tried the brown dog, but you cannot find something nearly as close to detailing material life, your environment, or an individual as a photograph. It contextualizes research, it puts it in a broader context for you to see, and it conveys mood, which is something we really lose in words sometimes. The disciplines I used for my capstone project were visual arts, which really provide the technical skills to conduct visual research. Media and communication studies, which provided me a tool to look at intercultural communication and how we can become more visually literate almost as a society. And anthropology provided me the social structure and research structure for how to apply visual methodologies. So to begin off with, I wanted to just take a look at an image that's being used in each of my 3 disciplines. Many of you may be familiar with Migrant Mother, which is a social realist photograph taken during the Great Depression by Dorothea Lange. We have 3 children. We have baby, 1 child, another child, and the mother. This photograph meant to convey the struggle of living in poverty during the Great Depression. It's an excellent photograph. It conveys mood, as we talked about. But in terms of its use as a scientific work, it's inaccurate. As scientists, we wouldn't come up with and forge our results, which is, in essence, what Dorothea Lange does in this photo when she positions the children to turn in towards their mother. If you look at the entire series, they're actually laughing beforehand. Here's another photo. Media and Communications, it's a photojournalistic style photograph of VJ Day in Times Square, 1945, right after World War II. This photo was published in Life magazine and depicts a sailor grabbing a nurse and thrusting her backwards and planting a kiss on her lips. If you had to just see that in a magazine, you would think, oh my gosh, that's a sailor who's been away and he's come back and that's his long lost love. But without any context, that's inaccurate too. He actually went up and down Times Square grabbing random women and kissing them on the lips. The photographer waited until he just grabbed the perfect woman that provided black and white contrast to get that shot. So here's the problem with using anthropology. While it may be an objective construction of what's going on, and while it may be unaltered, the aesthetics of this image struggle. We don't really know what's going on in the photo because it's not aesthetically composed. It's not thought out in terms of its composition, and the photographer is not technically trained. Which is why we bring up why we need a methodology for visual research methodology, why one discipline in itself is not good enough, and why we need to integrate comprehensively all three disciplines that we're using. So to construct the methodology of a methodology, you begin with data collection. You look at what is already out there, images in each three of the disciplines, and you conduct a literature search. You try to capture visual materials for yourself and see how you can do this, how you can produce a visual method. You then sort the data. What would make sense in terms of understanding the ethics of data production? What would make sense in terms of understanding how the timeline should work out with a visual methodology? There's the analysis, which goes back to our integrative strategies, and then the common ground strategies, which we discover latent commonalities between the disciplines that we may not see on initial observation. Our strategy, the two strategies I use for integration are checks and balances, and these are from the Miller, Boyce, and Sia, if you'd like reference on the strategies for integration. But checks and balances really looks at the three disciplines and finds ways that they can check and rather balance, like a government does, themselves or problems within the disciplines. So one of the things I looked at was an idea of ethics. What is ethically considered normative in each of the disciplines? In photojournalism, the concept of privacy issues and the National Press Photographers Association, among other associations for photographers, which regulate the study and publication of images. In visual arts, there's no standardized ethical code, but visual artists must be aware of who they're photographing. Is it in a public setting? Is it in a private setting? Do they have consent? And in anthropology, it's very, very controlled with the IRB, consent forms, and oftentimes the researcher participates in reflexivity, meaning that the researcher reflects on his or her own role in the research process. How did his or her involvement alter the final product results that were produced? The other strategy for integration that I used was bridging the explanation-action gap. Here, our explanation is found in anthropology. So we ask ourselves, what is the end goal of research? What is the researcher trying to accomplish? And then our action and how we can act on these questions is found in media and communications, as well as in visual arts. How can the researcher use photography and film to accomplish this goal? And what steps must be taken in composing and capturing an image? Now, because this work is so evolving in anthropology, there are very few people who have done it thus far. However, one of my favorite anthropologists, who also dabbles in visual methods, is Philippe Bourgois. And what he has studied, this image right here, is of heroin addicts in San Francisco and understanding their lifestyle and their struggles as a way to inform healthcare and public policy. Bourgois says, the image enables us to understand the pragmatic rationality for what may appear to be an entirely self-destructive or immoral act. In this case, understanding the context, the baggage that comes with heroin addiction, rather than just being repulsed by it on the surface levels. One of his interviewees says, if you can't see the face, you can't see the misery, which goes back into the idea that the image in itself provides this unbelievable sense of humanity to writing and to research. It provides a mood for you to understand, and it provides a connection that goes beyond a language barrier. In closing, the things that I was able to pull out of my experience producing a visual research methodology and actually applying it was that visual research requires time and research to understand the context that an image would be photographed in. It demands objectivity. It does not always require visual dissection, and dissection in the sense that when we typically think of anthropology and how anthropologists approach a culture, that we are looking at it as a whole, and then taking specific elements and saying, oh, well, what does that mean? The image does not require that. We can look at an image and still understand the holistic message of the image without saying, well, why is this in this place and why is that? Because it's not necessarily relevant. Visual research balances scientific truth with the aesthetic. If we think back to our photo, the anthropology photo, the aesthetic is so important in actually being able to communicate, because without the image being composed correctly, we can't find any information from it. And lastly, visual research enhances existing research methods. Having an image stand alone only goes so far, just as having research in traditional methods only goes so far. By working them together, they are able to advance research and bring it to the next level. Now, what I did in my Capstone project really only acts as a pilot. It's only relevant to anthropology, but it acts as a pilot for other disciplines that may be interested in using visual methodologies. Questions? Yeah.
So, forgive me this disclaimer. It may well have been that as I was writing down, I was missing crucial things you were saying. But I felt that I was getting something of a mixed message towards the beginning of your talk.
Sure.
A very powerful and compelling message that visuals would bring so much more meaning into my research.
Yes,
and yet
absolutely.
by the end, the idea that they're powerful little time bomb, well, not time, they're disruptive in their own right if not handled correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm trying to figure out the right
Sure,
way to
let
ask that
me act as the mediator
please
for
do.
you. So on the one hand, visuals are incredibly powerful, but on the other hand, they can be misconstrued so quickly, as we saw in the two images with the visual arts image and the media and communications image of the VJ Day. And so with the power of the image comes also this power to misconstrue research. And so that's why it needs to be used appropriately, and that's why it's so critical that a methodology even exists in the first place, so that we can find ways to use the image so that it's compelling, that it's eye-catching, that it provides more information, but that it's not misconstrued by the viewer. And there's a fine line there, I agree, but that's why it's so important that it's done properly and with a scientific academic context in mind.
So may I just finish up with a tiny sort of follow-up, and if there's no clean answer, don't worry about it, but how do we know when we're being objective with an image?
For me, one of the things I discussed in my capstone is really just thinking about what the end message of the research is, not what I want to convey, but what I have achieved through my research, and making sure that I can make that as clear as possible with the images I'm producing. So one of the things I consider is, okay, if I have, let's say I take a photograph of this room, but I really want to my whole writing is about you asking me this question. What might be best for me to do would be to crop that image onto you. And so looking for little ways that we can try to not alter an image significantly, but to use it as a way to communicate much more powerfully what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Yes?
I have a related question and a related comment. So one of your concerns seems to be that we can misinterpret images.
Yes.
Right? And one of the reasons we do that is because we don't have the context we need to make sense of it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's equally true of quotations, it's equally true
Oh,
of fieldwork
absolutely.
notes. So what standard methods already exist that can be applied to photography as they might be to other forms of other raw material? So that's the question. The comment is, I also felt like I was getting a mixed message because the title of your talk describes a research methodology,
Mm-hmm.
and there was some material about using images as a method of research,
Yes.
but there was a fair amount about the need to educate consumers of visual images so as to ensure they don't get the wrong message.
Sure.
And you also seemed interested in the use of images as a spur to action
Mm-hmm.
to do things that are indicated on the basis of other forms of research. And those are three different things.
Yeah.
So which are you interested in?
Well, I think really what the primary interest is not necessarily to call people to action or to educate the viewer, but really to educate the researcher on how to use it in a way that the viewer understands and the viewer is able to get the message. So I mentioned the concept of reflexivity, and I think that is actually really crucial in the production of images. is really just writing a little blurb with every image that you're producing, saying, this is the role of, this is why I'm including these images. This is what they're trying to convey. This is what may have been impacted by my presence there. And so to answer your first question in terms of standards, I really don't, because this is such an emerging thing, an emerging really method that's being used in academic context, there really aren't any standards. But I would suggest for anyone who's looking to go into this, the standards to turn to is really just go back to the 3 disciplines that I used and look at the standards within them. So look at the standards within press associations and their ethics and how they choose to get an image. Look at the standards within the IRB for conducting research with participants and other existing associations like that. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes?
Just so you can have a question from someone who doesn't have a pronounced accent.
Oh, yes, you do. A different accent.
No, I'm pretty sure I meant pronounced accent. Do you think that the standards that could be come up with, you can come up with sort of a sort of ethical standard would also be used to judge previous uses of photography as well, or is this something going forward, or would this also be used as a sort of backwards looking critique as well?
I think it could be for both. That's actually a really interesting point I hadn't considered. I originally intended, my idea in this construction was that it would be used going forward and just be a tool and a guide for researchers who are looking to incorporate this. But it could be used looking backwards and looking at photographs that have already been taken and saying, well, what are we missing here? How does this not fit into what we know about history at the time? How does this not fit into journal writings that we have and other documentation? I think that's a really interesting point. I think it certainly could be. Yes?
I know you've done some work on Baltimore and done some research on some of the people who write the eulogies for the son. And I'm always interested when I read eulogies constantly because you meet a lot of fascinating people, but I'm interested because sometimes you'll get a picture of someone that looks like Carrie, who's died at age 93.
Mm-hmm.
And they choose to put these young pictures in. And I understand that, but I wonder if in any of your literature they discuss how you select pictures, one picture for somebody whose life might have spanned 9 decades.
Yeah, you know, in the literature that, because even looking back at Migrant Mother, we'll go there. So the series, choosing that one specific image from a series had such a powerful impact for what she was trying to do as a photographer. And that's when it comes down to research. You don't necessarily want to communicate an agenda, but there is almost an agenda that comes out of your research. And I mean agenda in the sense that just a goal, an overlying message. And so keeping that in mind, looking at your photographs in front of you and saying which one best illustrates this individual, best illustrates this problem that's going on. And sometimes the image may not necessarily line up perfectly with your research. And that's okay too, because it shows another side of what's going on and completes that context that we're looking to gain.
Well, I also think it's an intention here sometimes. So
Sometimes, certainly.
If you had more time well, you'll have plenty of time in your PhD program, but if you had more time to incorporate other disciplines or perspectives into this, you mentioned ethics, and yet philosophy is not one of your core disciplines. Are there other areas or other disciplines that could inform this or help you to better construct a framework of ethics in photojournalism or bias? Like when you're saying, I'm going to choose an image, isn't there an inherent bias? And this image best represents what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think philosophy is a fantastic discipline because ethics is such a huge part of this, and ethics is such a huge part of research in general. So making sure you're familiar with the ethical boundaries of each thing. And I didn't choose philosophy because the ethics are so laden within each of the disciplines themselves. It wasn't really necessary to. But if I had more time, certainly philosophy, and probably even a technical field, just looking at the concept of what technically breakdown happens within the camera, within film in general, and how does that even add to that complexity of the image of what we're looking at. Yes, that's one line, yeah.
It used to be the attention getter, right?
Oh, yeah, I changed things up a little bit.
You know, could be.
Do you mind if I just ask you one more if there's literally, is there anybody else? Because it really was just go on. Go.
No, I just find myself thinking about how audio could be used in a similar way.
Yeah.
Audio clips, and I think of anthropology as a field that has done that, capturing music or
Yeah.
people. Have you thought about that? Are there people using it, and how would this framework apply to?
Yeah, so I thought that that's a great thing to go along with all of that. And one of the real rewarding things I had doing with my Baltimore research was I was able to interview someone who worked at Spurs Point. And he told me that when he was working at the steel mill, he would just listen to the sounds and then write poetry reflecting on that. And I remember thinking about that and thinking, wow, I wish I could hear what that sounds like. I wish I could hear what that specific thing looks like. And actually, even in like fine arts, there are many artists who record sound bites and use that to help convey mood. And I think that's an incredible tool to help contextualize research. I know I wish I could have incorporated that, let's say with my Baltimore project, just hearing just the sounds that he was talking about.
May I ask another question about experts? You mentioned Philippe Bourgois, is that how I say his name? And he wrote the book Righteous Dope Fiends,
Yeah.
is that right? Now, do the experts comment about their own bias? Like, was that photograph
Yes.
staged? His photographs aren't staged. I mean, but I don't know how he inserts himself in such a culture without some sort of Hawthorne effect, where does he write about his effect on how he makes
Yes.
himself invisible to the culture?
Yeah, he does. And I think really that's one of the things I love about anthropology is because there's this transparency between the researcher and the person reading the research. But that's exactly what he does. It's in the beginning, especially in the introduction, he just talks about why he's having images, how he's relating to the images, whether or not the images were staged or not, which they weren't, and just talking about what the purpose of them is, what the purpose of including them, and how that they add to the research or take away in certain instances. And as he goes through in the entire ethnography, you see him constantly referring back to the images. One of the things he mentions is that in the process of writing the ethnography, they were constantly reflecting back on the photographs they took to see what they missed along the way. And I thought that was a really interesting way to integrate visual methods in an entirely new way.
We have the luxury of just questioning you till the sun.
No, it's fine, it's
Thank you ever so much.
Yeah,
Well, once again, congratulations for graduating
Thank
with
you.
departmental honours.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much. This is great. Thank you so much.
Nice job.